Through countless ages, the towering Rossland ramparts have greeted the rising sun, and for the last 3/4 of a century have looked down at the unfolding drama of the Golden City. Intimately bound into that drama is the story of the Columbia and Western Railway. Rossland's Columbia and Western Railway is not only historically important to the province of British Columbia, but with its spiral loops and switchback, it ranks in technical interest with the Canadian Pacific's mainline spiral tunnels in the Rockies. The Rossland Hill was the first division laid down of the Columbia and Western, and was constructed in 1896 by the dynamic young F. Augustus Heinz to connect the rich copper gold mines of Rossland with his newly built smelter at Trail Creek Landing. The rail started at the steamboat landing on the banks of the Columbia River and snaked and climbed for 14 tortuous miles to the end of steel, 2,300 feet higher at the famous Leroy mine in Rossland. Heinz originally proposed a mule-powered tramway 8 miles long with a 6% grade, but quickly changed his plan to a narrow-gauge railway with a 4.5% grade. The ruling grade against uphill traffic was actually 4.8%. The line was 3-foot gauge and was named the Trail Creek Tramway. Before construction was completed, however, Heinz was granted a charter to build the Columbia and Western Railway from the Columbia River to Penticton via Rossland. The assets of the tramway were promptly transferred to the Columbia and Western Charter, but local people continued to call it the Trail Creek Tramway. For his railway, Heinz purchased used rails from Alberta and narrow-gauge rolling stock from Brigham Young's Mormon Group in Utah. Included in the purchase was Brigham Young's lavishly decorated private car. Heinz fitted it out with passenger seats, and the paying customers, saints and sinners alike, rode the Rossland Hill under a canopy of painted angels and cherubims. Heinz's little narrow-gauge locomotives weighed only 20 tons and could be shipped on standard-gauge flat cars. They arrived at Trail Creek Landing by river barge. Here is the diminutive narrow-gauge train at the Trail Creek Station, with steam up ready to start out on the grueling climb to Rossland. The locomotives were wood burners and were fueled with cordwood cut and stacked along the right-of-way. This picture shows one of the narrow-gauge locomotives cutting out a car of lumber on the smelter flats. The lumber must have come from one of the small mills along the route to Rossland. The manner in which the lumber car is loaded suggests that the line was operated with something less than complete regard for the rules of railroad safety. In 1898, the Canadian Pacific Railway Company purchased Heinz's smelter and acquired a permanent lease on his Columbia and Western Charter. The Rossland Hill was converted to standard gauge, and the little passenger coach, with its angels and cherubims, and at least one of the narrow-gauge locomotives went to the White Pass and Yukon Railway. The CPR did extend the Columbia and Western toward the coast, but not via Rossland and not to Penticton. It was built from Robson to Midway by way of the Arrow Lakes and the Farron Summit north of Rossland. The Canadian Pacific replaced Heinz's little engines with coal-burning, standard-gauge, consolidation-type locomotives such as this one standing in the Smelter Flats yard. The gaily decorated train in this picture was actually preparing to leave on the first run from Trail to West Robson on the Arrow Lakes. To handle the heavy ore trains on the Rossland Hill, the CPR for a time used the strange-looking Shea engines. These engines had vertical cylinders on each side, geared to the driving wheels, and were used mostly by the logging industry. The Shea engines were slow and had a marked tendency to jump the track, so the CPR replaced them with conventional locomotives, such as the consolidation type coupled to an ore train on the center star trestle at Rossland. The trestle at this time was in the process of being filled in with waste rock from the mines. Early day railroading on the Rossland Hill was a hazardous business. Runaways and derailments were not uncommon. Not every trainload of ore reached the smelter safely, as witnessed by this pileup on the curve at Milk Creek. Engine 3655 had just pulled into the Rossland yard when this picture was taken in 1935. In the manner that made steam engines appear to be endowed with life, it was still panting from the steep haul up the Rossland Hill. 3655 was representative of the 3600 class of modernized consolidation-type locomotives that were the workhorse of southern British Columbia. Consolidation-type locomotives had 2 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels. This made them very well suited to the steep grade and tight curves on the Rossland Hill. At this time, they were still hand-fired coal burners. They also had canvas curtains to close off the cab in winter. Later modifications replaced the curtains with doors. By the early 1950s, the 3600 class locomotives had been converted to oil burners, and the life of the fireman became more envious. Not long after this picture of a 3600 entering the lower reaches of Rossland was taken, the era of steam on the Rossland Hill came to an end. The bark of the steam locomotive gave way to the throb of the diesel-electric in the early 1950s. This double-header diesel at the highway crossing at Rossland is typical of the 8400 class that replaced steam on the Rossland Hill. By 1966, the 8400s had been themselves superseded by 8500 and 8700 class diesels. A larger 8900 class was also tried on the Rossland Hill, but its 6-wheel trucks were too tight for the curves. After one rail-shaving trip that was climaxed by a derailment, the 8900 locomotive was not brought up again. Passenger service on the Rossland Hill was terminated in the mid-1930s, when all-weather highway travel between Rossland and Trail became a reality. Freight service continued for another 30 years, but by 1960, the modern highway truck had drained this business too away from the railway. In March 1966, the last scheduled train moved down the hill from Rossland, and 70 years after Heinz ran his first little train, the line was officially abandoned. In July of the same year, the tracks from Warfield to Rossland were lifted. Now, through the medium of camera and tape recorder, let us take one last ride on the historic Rossland branch of the Columbia and Western Railway.
We are in the Tadanac yard in the Cominco plant at Tadanac, BC. Engine number 8719 is just hooked onto the caboose, and we're backing down the yard now to pick up the section crew and 2 or 3 cars to take up the hill to Rossland. The conductor on this trip is Ed Waterer, and the engineer is Ray Comiskey. We're now in the Tadanac yard. You can hear the shunting trains going by. On this trip, the locomotive and caboose will be pushing a string of cars up the hill because there are no passing tracks left in Rossland. They have been taken up. Only the main track is left, so that the locomotive will push its load up the hill. 3 days ago, the first train went up this hill since the abandonment of the line in March. Because of rusty rail and because of the grass that has grown over the track, considerable difficulty was experienced in getting the train up to Rossland. They were pushing 3 gondolas and 3 flat cars, plus the large crane that is being used for lifting the rails. And at several spots, because of the tight curvature, the rusty rail, and because of the slippery grass on the track, the locomotive stalled, and engineer Ray Comiskey had his work cut out for him to get the outfit up the hill that day. However, now that several trips have been made up the line, the trip today should be a little easier. There is a possibility of stalling, but in all probability there will not be too much difficulty. You can hear the diesel locomotive idling. It's connected directly in front of the caboose here. We're waiting in the yard now. The crew is gathering, and in a few minutes we will be taking off for the trip up to Rossland. The train is now moving ahead in the Tadanac yard, moving very slowly now toward the end of the yard and to the main track out of the Tadanac yard, heading for Rossland. This morning we are pushing 4 gondola cars ahead of us. There are trainmen riding in the front gondola car because, as we said before, we are pushing this string of cars up the hill to Rossland. You can hear the locomotive beginning to push now. In a minute we'll be approaching the crossing at Tadanac. You'll hear the locomotive whistle for the crossing. People are just beginning to come to work here. This is the office staff are just streaming in. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. That's the whistle. We're on the curve now. The locomotive is really beginning to push. We are still on the section of track that will not be abandoned. This is the section of track to Warfield. When we get to Warfield, then we will begin the 7.5 miles of track that is now being removed. At this stage, we're leaving Tadanac. We're on the upgrade, and we're rounding the curve whereby we can look down from the train into the gulch at Trail, and we're heading toward the Annabelle subdivision. The train is now approaching Annabelle, and in a minute or two now we'll be going around the big curve at Annabelle that swings back up to the Warfield Flat. This is pretty well the general route of the narrow gauge road as it wound its way up to Warfield. You can hear the flanges squeal on this curve. This is a big, long curve at Annabelle, and the noise from the rails and the wheels makes quite a sound here as the locomotive pushes this string of cars now up the steep hill onto Warfield Flat. We're now passing over the highway underpass just below the flats of Warfield. And on our left here is an area where the old narrow gauge roadbed used to swing around into the hillside. This has only just recently been obliterated, but old timers will remember the exact spot. We're now coming through the cut on the curve into Warfield Flats, and on the right-hand side of the train there still remains a section of the old narrow gauge roadbed, which, although it's becoming overgrown with grass, is still visible in Warfield here.
At this stage we are passing through Warfield on the straight stretch of track that parallels the highway. In a minute we will be entering upon the abandoned section of track which is going to be removed to Rossland.
At this stage, we are now leaving Warfield. We're entering upon the last 7.5 miles of track, which is the mileage of track that's now been abandoned to Rossland. And these are the rails that will now be coming up. From this point on is the abandoned track. The section of track we're now on meanders through fields on the hillside here. It's not too steep, but up ahead of us in the valley begins to narrow and the valley sides become steeper. And a mile or so ahead of us now is the approach to the switchback, which is the unique feature of this line. And soon the locomotive and the cars ahead will be entering the sharp turn that leads into the first loop of the switchback. It's a beautiful sunny morning on this trip, and the hillsides are in bloom with syringa bushes and elderberry bushes, which are just a mass of bloom this morning. It's really a pleasant ride going up this hill to Rossland this morning. At this point in the track, we're going alongside the old Rossland Road, which of course is now abandoned for the modern highway. The valley is narrowing ahead of us now, and we're approaching the beginning of the loop of the switchback. It's just a short distance ahead now, and soon the front end of the train will be entering the cut that leads us into the switchback.
At this spot, let's project ourselves ahead of the train for a moment to take a look at the switchback. Uphill traffic enters the bottom leg of the switchback through a spiral loop cut through solid rock. The curvature is 20 degrees, which is a very tight curve by railway standards. From the switch at Tiger, trains proceed backwards around a second 20-degree spiral loop and then traverse the mountainside on a long tangent to the top of the switchback at Crown Point. The distance from Tiger to Crown Point is 1 mile, and the gain in elevation is in the order of 200 feet. At Crown Point, the trains then proceed forward on the remainder of the climb to Rossland. In 1913, the Canadian Pacific Railway made plans to electrify the Rossland Hill. Orders were actually placed for locomotives, and the West Kootenai Power and Light Company was to have established a substation in the vicinity of the switchback to supply electrical energy to drive the locomotives. The Rossland Hill was to have been a trial installation, and if it proved successful, the West Kootenai Power and Light Company was prepared to build a transmission line from Bonington to Golden in the East Kootenai to electrify the main line of the CPR through the Rockies. For some reason, however, these plans never did materialize. Tiger presumably takes its name from Tiger Creek, and Crown Point is named for the nearby Crown Point mine. Tiger boasted a section house and a water tower to replenish the thirsty steam engines as they worked their way up the steep hill. This is a view of the switchback seen from the Rossland side of the valley. At the lower left is Tiger, and directly above it is Crown Point. This picture is taken on the track just downgrade from the Tiger Loop. Crown Point can be seen on the hillside just above. Here we are looking upgrade into the cut, which is the start of the Tiger Loop. And here is the other end of the loop as it enters Tiger. The concrete retaining wall supports the upgrade track on the bottom leg of the switchback. The tail track at Crown Point can be seen on the hill in the middle background. This is the switch at Tiger, looking back from the ascending leg of the switchback. The water tower, removed after dieselization, stood beside the section shack. A warning sign marks the end of the tail track at Tiger. A similar sign prevents trains from backing off the end of the tail track at Crown Point. This mile board just above the switch at Tiger indicates that it is 1 mile to Crown Point. This is the top of the switchback at Crown Point. The tracks level out at the switch and on the tail tracks, but note how the lift begins again just at the corner on the left of the picture as the track heads again uphill for Rossland. The weather-worn signboard at Crown Point limits the speed to 5 miles an hour over the Frog. President Shaughnessy of the CPR once suffered the indignity of having to complete a trip to Rossland in a caboose after his private car was derailed at this switch. And just below the switch at Crown Point, this mile board says that it is 1 mile back downhill to Tiger. And now let's return to the train.
We're now proceeding through the cut on the bottom loop of the switchback. You can hear the wheel flanges scream on this tight turn. The other day, the locomotive got stuck in here, but the rails are dry enough now that he's able to push straight through. At the present moment, we're entering upon the switch at the lower end of the switchback, which is known on the railway timetables as Tiger. The engineer has cut the throttle now, and the train is drifting in over the switch. At this point, the train is now proceeding backwards up the mile-long swing back of the switchback. At the moment, we're on a straight stretch of track, but presently we'll go on to a big wide loop that swings in toward the golf course and then back into the mountainside up toward Crown Point, which is the top station or switch on the switchback. The train has just proceeded around the big loop on the switchback and is now beginning to go up the long tangent run, which is fairly steep, up to the switch at Crown Point. The train is still moving backwards. You can hear the wheels screaming as we come onto the switch at Crown Point. The train is moving backwards over the switch now, and will be slowing to a stop, and then we will be moving ahead and proceeding then on to Rossland. At this juncture, one of our 4 gondolas is being switched out here at the switchback and being left on the bottom leg of the switchback. We'll pick up the other 3 and then proceed on up the hill to Rossland. The bang you hear is the cars being coupled again to the engine in preparation for the trip up the hill to Rossland from the switchback. We're now at Crown Point. The present standard gauge switchback is on a different location from the original narrow gauge switchback. This was changed when the CPR took over from Heinze and broadened the gauge of the road. You can still see remains of the old narrow gauge roadbed in this vicinity. The train is coupled up again and now proceeding toward Rossland. The locomotive is pushing fairly hard and you can hear the exhaust. It's rather loud, and the grade from here on in is fairly steep. Corners are tight. There could be some trouble getting up unless the rails are fairly dry this morning. The diesel locomotive that is pushing this train up the hill is a 1,500 horsepower, 8700 type, capable of pushing around 400 or pulling 450 tons up this grade. The 3600 type steam locomotives that were superseded by the diesels were capable of pulling only around 200 to 250 tons. More than 5 or 6 boxcars required a helper engine. The grade is 4.5%, and this, of course, is very steep for railroading purposes. At this point, we can look back down the valley toward Warfield. We can also look up the valley, and we begin to see the outskirts of Rossland. We can see Mount Roberts, and we can see Red Mountain, and we can see the houses on the eastern edge of the town. We're getting into fairly tight corners here. You can hear the wheels, the flanges of the wheels screaming on the curves. You can hear the locomotive beginning to push harder as we hit this tight corner here. We're getting opposite Rossland now. We can look across the valley. We're directly south of Rossland. We can see pretty well the whole of the town now. It's a brilliant, sunshiny day, and it's a beautiful trip up here this morning. We're approaching the big curve in the south belt of Rossland. This takes us around the end of the valley, and then we start to head across the valley, following the mountainside to the outskirts of Rossland. Still heavy grade, locomotive is still pushing hard, but we're having no trouble getting up so far this morning.
We are now rounding the big curve in the south belt.
The train is now approaching the outskirts of Rossland. We're in what we call the south belt now. We can look up, we can see pretty well the whole town of Rossland. We'll soon be getting in where they'll have to start using the whistle. There will be crossings on the way from here on in.
The rock in this picture is painted with a faded sign that announced to the passengers on that side of the coach that the Hoffman House had 50 first-class rooms and sold the finest Scotch whiskey in town.
The section of track we're on now has most of the spikes removed and most of the bolts from the rail joints. It's not the type of track that one would want to speed over. On this trip, the train is traveling about 20 miles an hour. This is probably an average speed on this hill at best. entering the lower end of Rossland, known as the Union Avenue Station. The whistle we just heard is the first crossing as we enter town. We're just coming alongside the old Spitzy mine now, and we'll soon be crossing another street here, and then we'll go into the big curve where the water tower used to be, and we'll swing back east and up through the town and toward the old station.
This is the water tower. It had been dismantled a short time before this trip was made. During the days of the passenger trains, a small station stood beside the water tower for the convenience of customers in the lower end of town. Known as Union Avenue Station, it was a scheduled stop on the railway timetable. Union Avenue Station was actually at Cook Avenue. The explanation seems to be that whereas the original stopping point was at the siding at Union Avenue, it was later moved up alongside the water tower at Cook Avenue so that the steam locomotives could take on water and discharge passengers while making only one stop. The water tower was fed from Rossland's historical Spud Murphy Spring. During the acute winter water shortages in 1927 and 1929, many Rossland residents hauled water from this tank for domestic use.
We're rounding the big curve. We've just passed the location of the old Union Avenue Station, and we're now proceeding up through the lower end of town. We'll soon be crossing the main highway between Trail and Rossland. The whistles will become more frequent at this point. We're still following pretty well the old route of the narrow gauge railroad. The actual narrow gauge station that was a good long whistle for a crossing that's coming up here. The old narrow gauge station, the noise you just heard are branches brushing the side of the caboose here. The track has not been kept in shape during the past few years. As I was saying, the old narrow gauge station is up near the crossing of the main highway into Rossland. We're now entering into a rather tight spot where the train got stalled here the other day, where the grass is thick. We're passing underneath the Washington Street pedestrian bridge, but we're going to get through here without any trouble today by the looks of it.
This lush growth of grass on the tracks, well watered by seepage from Spud Murphy Spring, is what caused the train to stall under the Washington Street pedestrian bridge in the previous picture. The slippery grass and a faulty sander on one wheel of the locomotive and the sharp curvature at this point all combined to delay the train a full 20 minutes at this spot. We're now
rounding the bend, and when we get around this bend, we will be at the site. The long whistle is for the highway crossing. We're just passing the site of the old narrow gauge railroad station, and now we're proceeding on up around the curve, and we'll circle the town, and we'll come up to the present station area about 1 mile from here. Although it's a mile from here, it's only about 2 blocks straight uphill. However, because of the steepness of the hillside, the railroad must take the long way around, still maintaining its 4.5% grade.
This is the main highway crossing at Rossland and the site of the old narrow gauge station. For passengers and freight, this was the end of the line, but the ore trains went on up for another 3 miles or so to the end of track at the famous Leroy mine. This is another view of the highway crossing overlooking the site of the narrow gauge station. The steep grade and tight curvature are very apparent in the background of this picture.
We're just entering the cut into the railway yard now. This is just at the location of the old safety switch, which of course now has been removed in the last few days, so we don't have to stop for the safety switch. We'll proceed right into the cut.
This is the safety switch just below the curve that enters the cut into the Rossland yard before it was dismantled. It was always set against uphill traffic so that all trains proceeding uphill had to stop at this point to allow the brakeman to set the switch in favor of the train. The purpose of the switch was to catch any rolling stock that might get loose from the Rossland yard and divert it into the hillside. This curve just above the safety switch and leading into the cut at the entrance to the Rossland yard is an example of the type of track construction used on the Rossland Hill. Dead man ties were planted against the inner rail to prevent the track from moving outward on the curve. Rail snubbers were also used at intervals to anchor the rails against the ties so that the rails would not tend to move downhill due to the thrust of the locomotive driving wheels. This is the top of the rise into the Rossland yard.
We have entered the Rossland yard now, and the train will switch around and pick up the crane and proceed on up toward the Y to the business of track removal. We're now sitting in the cab of the locomotive. We'll be hooking on to the crane in a minute, and then you will hear the sounds of the locomotive releasing the brakes and moving back toward the switch. You've just heard the air brake being released. Now the engineer is applying the power. The locomotive is now beginning to pull the string of cars and the crane backwards. We're moving backwards now toward the switch, down into the rock cut, which is the entrance to the yard. You can hear the brakes being worked as Ray maneuvers the train back into the cut as we pull the string of cars and the crane out of the yard in preparation to putting them up on the track that leads up to the Y. The locomotive is actually in the cut now. Brakes are being applied. The train is slowing to a stop. We can't see the end of the train now because we're around the curve, but Ray will be getting his signal as to when to stop and reverse.
That noise you just heard is the engineer taking his foot off the dead man control.
That was the signal that we're now going to proceed ahead. We can't see the end of the train, but we can see the signal man. The locomotive is slipping at this point. This is a tight curve. The train is fairly long, but we're gradually edging ahead as Ray applies sand to the rails. The train is starting to move slowly now. Locomotive is back into the cut again now. We still can't see the end of the train. Now we're coming into view. Now we can see our train starting to push over the switch. Again, the sound of the air brakes being maneuvered while the train is brought to a halt at this point.
Let's leave the train now as it gets on with its job of track removal. In June 1896, a jubilant group of workmen drove the ceremonial golden spike at the end of track at the Leroy mine. 70 years later, on July the 6th, 1966, a more subdued group of workmen and citizens of Rossland observed the ceremony of lifting the first rail. Mayor Harry LaFay in this picture recalls the important part played by the railroad in the lives of the people of Rossland. In reply to Mayor LaFay's remarks, Canadian Pacific's Divisional Superintendent, Mr. A.W. Grassi, defines changed conditions that have now led to the abandonment of the Rossland Hill. In this picture, track removal is underway in the Rossland yard. This enterprising young Rossland businessman is quick to realize that an honest dollar can be turned from the combination of thirsty track workers and ice-cold lemonade. Here, track removal has progressed down into the cut at the entrance to the Rossland yard. And several days later, the track removal crew reaches the main highway crossing at Rossland. By the end of a week, the rails are lifted as far as the site of the old water tower. And where the steel track had existed for 70 years, there now remains an empty roadbed. By the third week in July, the track had been lifted back to the top of the switchback at Crown Point. Finally, on August the 3rd, track removal was completed to Warfield. Beyond the newly placed bumper block at the end of track, the empty roadbed winds back into the autumn hills, a mute reminder that the Rossland Division of the Columbia and Western Railway and the men who conceived and operated it have now passed into the pages of railroad history. And now listen once again to the sound of the upbound train. As we first hear it working its way up the valley, then the call of the whistle approaching closer and closer, while the echoes rebound from the surrounding hills. Then the rising crescendo of the diesel engine as it emerges around the curve, passes by, and moves on up to the station yard, the last train into Rossland.